Hello, good afternoon, everyone. So, welcome all of you to our monthly informal talks by AIT Extensions of the Asian Institute of Technologies. As I remember this informal talk, perhaps this is the number 5 or 6 that we are running since the beginning of 2021. And as you know that this webinar or this talk is organized to share experience, actually to share experience with the audience in different fields, so that we can share the practical part of the works that AIT Extension has been doing on different projects, and also different capacity development that conducted by AIT Extensions. We also would like also to bring the audience into exploration of the new areas that we can explore further, maybe in the form of the research and development, is in the form of the human resource development, also in the form of the innovation. So we do organize this talk for the informal interactions from different group of professionals. And as you know, sometimes we organize this in Thai to address for the Thai audience, and also sometimes we organize this in English so that we can address the issues in a widely regional and global issues that we are talking. And sometimes I run the session by myself, sharing the experience from AIT Extension perspectives, and also many occasions we also invite the external resource persons to share experience with us. So today is another occasions that AIT Extension is very happy and very honored that we have the senior advisors coming to our program. And the senior advisors today will be talking or sharing some practical experience about the power sectors. So may I introduce to you our speaker today, Mr. Sonam Chering. So as you know that from the shot, from the banner that you see, Mr. Sonam has been in the energy sector for a very long time. Not only that, he used to serve as the Director and Director General of the Department of Energy in Bhutan, but he also, served as the top level in the Ministry of Economic Affairs of the government of Bhutan. And when we had chance to meet in the consultancy projects that we have been doing in the Mekong region, so I had chance to work with Mr. Sonam, being the team leader of that project. Mr. Sonam was the team leader. So AIT also learned a lot from Mr. Sonam, not only from the technical perspective and also organizational perspective, and also the government perspective, policies perspective, but it's also in terms of the leadership perspective that Mr. Sonam has shown to junior consultants, so to say, I mean the consultants, and also the organization and the firm that Mr. Sonam has shared his experience. Having said that, also the Ministry of Energy, Department of Energy that we are working with at that time, also very much benefit indirectly from Mr. Sonam leaderships and his contribution to that project. So having said that, the program today, we are going to explore from the practical perspective of the PPP, the public-private partnership in the power sector. We will take you along by the aspects or topics that Mr. Sonam will talk, that to explore how the public-private partnerships regulation and policy of the government should be addressed in order to be able to overcome challenges, and also be able to uplift the country's policy to be sustainable power sector development. All right, so without further ado, I would like to now give the floors to Mr. Sonam to introduce himself, and then maybe we can go through discussion in the later stage on the issue related to the public-private partnerships. So Mr. Sonam, please.
Thank you, Joe, for inviting me to be a speaker on your webinar dealing with the public-private partnership in the power sector. I guess this is not a new topic, so maybe many of the people who will be listening, hopefully, to our discussions may be aware of what it involves. As far as my introduction is concerned, I don't think there is a need for me to repeat what you have said already, but I've worked for over 34 years in various fields with the government of Bhutan. But since 2016, I've been working as an independent consultant, focusing on the energy and aviation sector. But today's discussion will be mainly in the field of energy. And so I would be happy to share my experience that I gained while working with the government of Bhutan and while working as a team leader in the project with the Lao government. And subsequently, I've also been working on some regional projects in the South Asian region, dealing with energy trading issues. So I guess many of these discussions and issues that we can talk about will be useful in the course of our greater analysis of the public-private partnership sector. Thank you, Joseph. I hand over to you.
Yes, and yeah, I mean, I missed the part that, you know, I also wanted to tell that Mr. Sonam used to be the CEO of the Druk Air Aviation also in Bhutan. So he used to, you know, working in the area of aviation, and that is very actually very exciting to know about that. So Mr. Sonam, perhaps my first question to you is how you would share with us about the what we have to take into the consideration of the significance of the PPP in the power sector in the future.
Thank you. You know, the power sector, unlike other products, power is basically a strategic resource required by countries all over the world in order to stimulate your economy. It is not an end product by itself, but it drives the economy. And so we can see all over the world that wherever there is abundance of power, the economies tend to flourish. Where there is a lack of power, even for meeting basic needs as electrification, the economic status of those countries are still pretty underdeveloped. So there is a direct correlation between the power sector and economic development. So in that respect, you know, traditionally the governments have been responsible for providing power to their citizens. But as time went by, with the advent of public-private partnership that started in late 1980s and then picked up in 1990s, it became quite clear that if there was a better way of providing this valuable resource to the citizens, perhaps the economic development in those countries could even be faster. Depending on government budgetary support would take its own course of time, and then there would be big challenges as far as providing timely and efficient delivery of services is concerned. So that's when the idea of trying to outsource the provision of power to the private sector came up. When we talk about PPP, what is PPP actually? PPP is essentially a long-term contract between a private agency and a government agency. The responsibility of the private sector is either to build an asset or to provide certain services, and for which the private sector bears certain provisions of the risk. The government agency bears certain portion of the risk, and the management of the resources is in the hands of the private sector for an agreed period of time. This period of time is normally defined as a concession period, which would differ from the type of power that you are involved in, you know. And but how does the private sector get benefit out of this? So private sector is basically the payment to the private sector is based on performance linked. If the private sector is not able to provide the services that they were contracted to do so, then there would be penalties also involved. So I think this is how gradually PPP became popular, and it mainly came out in the infrastructure sector. And power being very much a part of an essential infrastructure in any development was an ideal sector where PPP could be used for development of the power sector. Now, if you look in most countries, you will find that the power sector was basically dominated by state-owned enterprises. And the state-owned enterprises, I mean, if you look in South Asia, all the countries have the state-owned enterprises playing their major role. If you look at, for instance, in Thailand, there is the EGAT as a major state-owned enterprise. In our context in Laos, we had EDL, another state-owned enterprise. And so initially, these state-owned enterprises tended to be a very vertically integrated company. So when you say vertically integrated, they became responsible for generation, transmission, distribution, and supply of electricity. So it was entirely a vertically integrated company. And gradually, when governments decided to involve private sector, it was felt that the generation sector was probably the most suitable. Transmission and distribution, by virtue of being the wire business, tended to be a natural monopoly. And handing over any monopoly to a private sector, I don't think that is desired, because it could lead to high costs. It could lead to misuse of monopoly and so on. And so governments felt more comfortable if the monopolistic sectors remained within the government, but there would be a sector regulator to see the code of conduct around which the monopoly companies would operate. So to a large extent, as I mentioned, the PPP in the power sector started off mainly with generating companies. And so we have, if you look at countries around the region, there are many private sector now involved in the generation sector. To quote our own experience in Laos, the major generation, Laos had over 6,000 megawatts of installed capacity. And out of that, more than 50-60% are now in the private sector domain. And similarly, in many other countries now, the private people are being involved in providing generation electricity through different sources, whether it be through hydro or whether it be through thermal. And now on how the basis of how the generation sectors are doing these projects, majority of the countries follow an unsolicited bidding process.
Okay.
The governments know exactly how much electricity is required for the country. So based on that, the government would bid out for private sector to show interest in developing that particular project. Now, depending on the source of energy, the bidding process would differ, whether it's a thermal power plant or whether it's a hydro power plant. Thermal power plants tend to be normally based near the pit head, where the fuel is coal. So in order to cut down on cost, you would locate a thermal power plant near a coal mine or so on. Because hydro, you have to have located in a particular area where there is adequate water, where there is adequate head to generate the necessary power, and so on. Then, of course, the concession period also would differ. In some countries, the projects are given a concession period of maybe 35 years, 5 years for construction period and 30 years for operating the power plant, after which the project then gets returned to the government at no cost. So essentially, the private sector recovers all his cost of investment through the 30-year generation period that he is allowed to operate. The concerns of the government while bidding out projects would mainly be on affordability issues. Because at the end of the day, government is not going to use the power. It is the citizens who need power. And for the citizens, especially in developing countries, affordability is a major issue. So to counter that, government then follow a tariff-based bidding system. In a tariff-based bidding system, the company that bids the lowest levelized tariff would be given the opportunity to develop that project. And in the hydropower sector, initially, some of the countries were going to bidding based on royalty energy. So how much of energy was the bidder going to give to the state, the country where the project is being developed, on a free basis? So this could vary from 10 to 15% to 20%, and the concession period also is very important, because the longer the concession period, hopefully you should be able to reduce the tariff, because the project could be amortized over a long period of time instead of over short periods. And projects, power projects normally tend to be very complex and capital intensive. So in order to ensure how the cost could be reduced to the extent possible, the concession period also plays a major role. I've got the...
So Mr. Sonam, can I just interrupt? So now going back to the issue of the private sector. So how, and we are looking at the policy perspective of the engaging the private sector to the power production and power generation. So what would be the targeted policies that to incentivize, the private sector to, who is looking for the profit of the businesses, but at the same time, they have to handle the public good, which is the power generation there. So how this is going to be matched between the interests of the private sector and the public affairs?
Well, in these public-private partnership arrangements, one of the main key issues is the sharing of risk allocation. And so when you develop a project, what are the types of risk involved? There may be a risk with the site that is located. There may be a risk in terms of selling the power. There may be a risk in terms of the fuel availability, whether if it is to do with coal, if it is to do with hydro, in terms of water. And then there may be risk in terms of financing risk. Then there may be in terms of political risk. And then there may be certain force majeure issues and so on. So the issue basically is between the two parties, the government and the private sector. You would come to an agreement on what are the risks that the government will take and what are the risks that the private sector takes. And the basic principle around risk allocation is based on the fact that the agency that is most suited to take that risk should take that risk. I mean, for instance, you can't ask the private developer to take political risk. And what do you mean by political risk? There may be expropriation. Suddenly, government may decide, we want to take over this power plant. Now, if such a scenario happens, then how will that private developer be rewarded? There may be risk in terms of change in laws. So at the time when the project was being awarded to the private sector, let's say the tax laws are of certain nature. But during the time when, even before the project generation could even start, the tax laws changed to an extent that all of a sudden there were many unhidden costs added to the project developer. Now, who's going to pay for that? So all these risk issues will ultimately be translated into your concession agreement. So in concession agreement, you would clearly identify what risk the developer will be responsible for and what risk the government will be responsible for. And then the two will have to basically commit themselves to saying that we will take care of this risk. Now, there are other risks like, force majeure issues. Suddenly, if there's a flood or if there's some major or if there's a war and the particular infrastructure gets destroyed, who will cover these type of force majeure issues?
Right.
This is where sometimes insurance companies can come into picture. So, but the premiums may be high. But at the end of the day, it's the question of how much coverage do you want to expose yourself? So those are there. Political risk. Now, when you talk about political risk, there are some areas, even when you do financing. Now, many governments are no longer keen to provide government guarantees because the money is ultimately borrowed from the commercial banks. But let's say if the developer is not able to pay back the money within the time frame or within the agreed amortization period, then what happens? And so some sort of a guarantee may need to come up in this area. And there, like agencies of the World Bank, like MEGA, is the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency. They will be able to provide some guarantees. So instead of a government taking up these guarantees, the MEGA would be in a position to provide that. Of course, there will be a cost involved. So the whole issue comes down to providing the right guarantees and ensuring that the risks are taken into account. So risk is a major issue during the process of negotiation between the two parties. And as I mentioned, ultimately, these will all have to be translated, reflected somewhere within your concession agreement. One important factor, of course, is the power purchase agreement. At the end of the day, the government has to sell the power, not the government, I mean the private developer has to sell the power to somebody, to a designated agency. So it depends to a large extent what is the purpose of that project that they were developing. So is it going to be the state-owned enterprise that is going to buy the power? What type of buying arrangement do you have? Is it take or pay arrangement, or is it, I mean, a take or pay, as you note, as you're aware, when we were in Laos, most of the that the entire market risk was being taken care of by EDL. So even the securing the market and how it is done, that's also an important aspect. And that is why banks will look at the power purchase agreement that exists. So if you have a state agency that is going to guarantee the taking of your power, I'm sure it's going to be much easier to, raise loans in the market. So even these are some important factors that you need to take into account. Yeah.
It's very interesting, actually, when you are explaining all of this, it's made me recall when we were in the projects office in Vientiane, and we were discussing about this, because it's very complicated things on giving concessions agreement to the power sector and power authority and agencies, and also when we are talking about how we are going to monitor, how the government or the oversight agency has to monitor the performance of the private sector to be compliant with the government regulations. So this is something like coming back, and it's very interesting for the audience to know. So when we are talking about risk, nowadays the questions or the issue which is related to the climate change, will this climate change situation, which is have some effect to the power generation, is a kind of factor that the private sector would take into consideration to invest on that, or how the government would handle the climate change issues in order to create an environment that the private sector is going to be playing the role there?
Right. I think that's a very relevant question in today's context. Because earlier, when governments needed to ensure that the country had enough power to drive the economy, the governments are not too concerned about the source of power. And so many thermal plants were built, and whether the power plants had contributed to climate change issues or not, those are not factors that were taken into account at that time. But now, increasingly, the climate change aspects need to be factored into the decision-making process of the government. When governments decide to develop power projects here on, I'm not talking about what has happened in the past, but now if we need to look at more generation to be added, then the source of fuel is very, very important. If you look at the Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015 by most of the UN member countries, I think this is a major milestone in terms of the seriousness of the countries to tackle climate change issues. And if you look at it, now, of course, the scientists have all said that it's proven that anthropogenic activities have contributed to climate change. And unless we do something about it, we will reach a situation where the climate would become irreversible, and the future generation would come under serious problems, and the whole world would be under a threat. So in many ways, I personally look at the Paris Agreement as a earth-saving agreement, I would like to say. Now, the essence of the Paris Agreement is that governments have all committed to ensuring that the increase in temperatures remain 2 degrees as compared to the pre-industrial age. Now, the current situation is that I'm told that in 2020, the the temperature increase has already reached to 1.2 degrees centigrade. So now the commitment of the countries is to ensure that this increase does not go beyond 2 degrees, but technically we should try to keep it at 1.5 degrees. So we really don't have much leeway to play with. And so the issue is, how do we tackle it? So when you tackle it, what are the sources of contribute to climate change? So energy is definitely one area. The transport sector is another area, the heating sector, the industrial sector, and so on. But in our context, when we talk about energy, then we need, so what is the commitment that the governments have made? So the commitment that the governments have made is that by 2050, we must reach a carbon neutral stage as far as the energy generation is concerned. So how do we go about doing that? Individual countries have given what you call national determined contribution. They have given some contribution.
Right.
This is not binding in nature, but this is, the commitment itself is binding in nature, but the NDCs are not actually binding in nature. It shows a time frame on the ways the countries would hope to achieve. And every 5 years, you can revise the NDCs. You know? Now, from a power perspective, the intention is that after 2030, you should no longer be investing in fossil fuel type of power generation plants.
Right.
At the moment, you can still go ahead. If you don't have, you could add a few more power plants, but after that, you must gradually ensure that these things are phased out. And by 2050, you can reach a carbon neutral stage. And that is where now, in terms of power sector, the focus on renewable energy needs to become more and more significant. In terms of the energy sector, what can you do actually? The energy demand of the world and the requirement, not only the requirements are so big that you just cannot say that, okay, by tomorrow, let's switch off all thermal plants, because it will have a major disastrous effect on the world economy. And so a phased planned manner is important. And even carbon polluting aspects, there are considerations of saying, okay, we can look at carbon capture and storage mechanisms as one aspect. You can still continue to use thermal plants, but perhaps we need to ensure that the carbon is not emitted into the sky, but perhaps is buried underground under a storage mechanism. But this is currently expensive. Side by side, we need to focus more and more on renewable energy. And that is where governments could play a critical role in providing the right environment for investment. And here, what I would like to say is the role that the governments can play. Many years ago, when the climate change concerns were not so great, but yet when there was a move to invest in renewable energy, the policy requirements were a little different. So governments came out with feed-in tariffs. So feed-in tariffs are basically tariffs for renewable energy. You identify, okay, you can sell your renewable energy power at this tariff, which is generally higher than the conventional source of electricity. Then there were issues like access to the transmission grid. You did not need, so you were given, if you are a renewable energy source, you were given priority, so you could get access into the national grid. So these are mechanisms that the government had introduced in the early days. But now, the good thing that has happened is over the years, the cost of renewable energy generation has come down so much that it has become competitive, like any other conventional forms of energy. And so countries have now started going in a big way, particularly in the solar and wind energy, where the bidding is done on the basis of tariff. And so you are getting, the power producers from these renewable energy sources providing tariffs that are as low as hydro or some other sources of energy. So this is becoming very, very attractive. And I guess this will probably give a lot of opportunity for people in who are interested in the power sector to focus more and more on the renewable energy resources, because just trying to ensure that we produce power at any cost is no longer an option. The climate change is a major concern. It has far-reaching impacts on all walks of life, and unless we are able to sort out the renewable energy, make it more attractive, to encourage renewable energy per se may be a challenge if it just be mere rhetoric. Yeah.
Right. So when we are going to concern about the climate change and also the impact to the environment, and like the project that we did in Laos, PDR, so we have to also consider a lot of regulations and laws from various sectors. So it became very complicated. So how the government should prepare for that in order to make the legal environments or legislative environments are very friendly to the investor or the private producer to come into the business, because there is a complexity in developing countries on actually there are so many regulations that they have to follow, and maybe it's very difficult to have a concession agreement because there might be also a kind of a policy risk in there. So how we are going to give the kind of a friendly environment on this issue?
Yeah, I think for the governments, transparency is very, very important. The private player needs to know exactly in what direction that they're heading. And so in order to do so, in the power sector, I think the basic tool is the electricity law. So many countries have laws that were perhaps developed 20 years ago, 10 years ago or so. So that bringing out a change in the electricity law to suit current developments is very important. The things like at the global level, when leaders meet and give certain commitments, those commitments need to translate into national policies or national laws to ensure that you're able to move forward and to achieve the targets that you have committed to do so. And so having the right legal and legislative framework is very, very important. One challenge that I see most of the time in the governments, I'm sure you might have seen in the works that you have done also, is that there are a lot of government agencies who are sometimes you land up, in conflicting roles instead of providing supportive roles. Now, I'll give you the example of the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, right? In the SDGs, it is a holistic goal that encompasses around 17 goals to be achieved. It addresses the economic issue, it addresses the climate change issues, it addresses the industrial issues, it addresses the educational aspects, it addresses general health issues and so on. So there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals that have been committed by all UN members to comply with. Now, these goals need to be translated and linked with your own national development goals. Because every country works, most countries, at least in our part of the world, tend to work in 5-year plans. So they need to be fixed into your 5-year plan. At the same time, what I've seen now in many parts of our region, we have democratically elected governments. So when democratically elected governments come in, I feel that the political parties need to be aware of international commitments. And so some of these commitments, they need to translate it into their manifesto so that before they are elected, they need to know, people need to know that these are the things that we need to do in order to achieve certain goals. And when I talk about climate change issues, I think the best thing is that in the most recent US election that has happened, Joe Biden has now committed to join the Paris Agreement. Because without US being a party to Paris Agreement, I'm not too sure how well it would succeed. So this is a very important thing where we can see, how climate change aspects can be addressed. And then, of course, the direct issue that you raised on the complex nature of organizations. Now, if you look at the energy sector, You can talk about energy, you can talk about economy, you can talk about environment. There is a nexus among the three E's, you could probably say. Now, all these, you cannot develop the energy at the cost of the environment. You cannot develop the economy at the cost of the environment. So the three E's must work together in a complementary manner. And that is where I feel that sometimes there are regulatory bodies. Some of these regulatory bodies are created through statutes, and some are probably created through government policies. Now, these regulatory bodies should work in unison, should work in harmony. For instance, if you are developing a project that has serious environmental issues, then the environmental ministry and the energy ministry, in my opinion, have to reflect the common interest. And we should not look at whatever the environment ministry has laid, that remains as Bible and there is no compromise. And whatever the energy ministry has done, it's all cast in stone, we can't move it. So that sort of attitude cannot be there. The two have to sit down together, and perhaps at the implementation level, it is the energy ministry that might be responsible for implementing a lot of things. So maybe some of the functions, the environmental ministry, which are key to ensuring that environmental is done together with the development of the project, that could be delegated to the environmental regulator, who then should be made accountable and answerable. He should not have an attitude that, I'm only interested in the end product, which is generation of electricity, and how that is done, at what cost to the economy, those things that we will disregard. I think that our attitude cannot be there. So there is a need for regulatory bodies to work together. Perhaps some aspects can be delegated to certain agencies. Then the other important aspect is in the government agencies is the fact that, we talk so much about fast-tracking clearances. We need to have a one-stop shop. And these things sometimes I find tend to be more of a thought, more of an thing, almost like a vision. But in terms of trying to achieve it becomes a big challenge. And that is where I think a clear understanding on what do you mean by one-stop shop. I think that needs to be clearly understood. It doesn't mean that one-stop shop means you give your application to one particular department, and after that, the department tells you, now you go there. So you go there, from there, somebody tells you, you go here. I think that should not be the intention. As far as the investor is concerned, his focal point should be the one-stop shop. And so from there, that one-stop shop should act as a facilitator and should ensure that all mandatory government clearances, permissions, licenses can all be provided to the private sector without him having to go and knock on different doors. I mean, in this age of IT world, the cross-linking between different agencies can all be done through IT, and the sector that is the so-called one-stop shop should be the face as far as the private sector agency is concerned. So these are issues that needs to be perhaps made more workable, and perhaps we could have a dialogue between the government and the private sector in these areas also.
Yes, when we were working there, I think one of the things that you recommend to the government was that we can approach the power sector developments or energy sector development by using the integrated water resource planning. So that is one of the approach that we would make a kind of the three E's together, or maybe a kind of a facilitative organization setup or development setup that can facilitate the power sector development in a more sustainable manner. So can you comment or can you give some view on how we are going to build in the three E's together by certain approach, like in this case, the integrated water resource development, for example?
Right. When you develop a project, prior to the physical construction starting, you need to do a detailed feasibility study. And that is the time where, in my opinion, all the environmental issues, the social issues, the cross-sectoral issues need to be addressed. Today, when you talk of environment or climate or energy, these cannot be looked in isolation. And water resources forms an important part of this nexus. Agricultural sector also forms a very important food and food security aspects also form a very important part of this sector. So when you take into account these integrated planning aspects, all the cross-sectoral issues need to be addressed, because there is a cost if you do it individually. And that is where, when you develop complex infrastructure, that is where the role of the National Planning Agency plays a critical role. The National Planning Agency must be able to clearly see the cross-cutting development areas that are taken into account, and should be able to convey to the agency that is looking after the energy sector to say that, oh, in the area where you are developing energy, we have a major drinking water scheme program. So how can that be integrated with the generation of power? Or you say we have a major school or hospital or road sector coming up in this area. So how could all these be integrated? So prior to the project developing, these are the areas that needs to be addressed. And I'm personally of the opinion that, at the end of the day, projects are bidded out by the government. And that is where I'm saying that we should not entertain unsolicited projects, because that leads to problems, that leads to starting projects that you had no plan to do so. So projects have to be done in a solicited manner. Governments must plan that, because of the complex nature of our projects. Governments must say that, okay, we are developing a 500 megawatt greenfield project in this area, or we are developing a huge solar project in that area, and we require 100 hectares of land and so on. So all those things, once you do that, then it needs to filter out to other agencies. And before you bid out the projects, in my opinion, if it is possible, and I'm sure it is possible, it requires a little more energy, all the mandatory clearance aspects, permissions, should all be done ahead. A major part of you can call it a pre-feasibility study, should also be done by a government agency. After all those things are completed, then you could bid out to the private developer. And you should let the private developer know that the environmental clearance will be more or less intact when you start the work. The site conditions, you will be given land without having to go into negotiation with private developers. Those issues will be all addressed. And what the labor issues, all those things, if you make it very clear to the private developer, you are likely to get more and more competitive bids. But if we give them the thing that, okay, we are planning to develop a particular project in this area, and we ask, tell you do all the studies yourself, everything, and then you start developing, the bids are going to be more expensive.
Right.
Might have bidders, but definitely it's going to be more expensive. And at the end of the day, who pays for it? The people, the citizens of the country will pay for it. So when you do in a planned manner, it is better to ensure that all the feasibility study and something, there is a government ownership. The private developer definitely has the onus of carrying out due diligence. He must vet the studies that have been carried out, because some things might be based on inadequate data. So those are aspects that need to be taken into account.
So then the governments in developing country would say that then they would have a challenge in terms of the capacity. So we can imagine that if the National Planning Agency have to do a screening at the beginning of the very long-term plan, maybe a 5 years or 10 years plan, how do they get the people, the government officials that have ability to, assess all of this, not only the policy regulation, but also the commercial agreement and all of this? So is that you see this as a challenge if the government would like to start maybe tomorrow on reforming the electrical power, development?
No, I don't think there would be a challenge, because as I mentioned when we started off, historically the power sector was developed by the government. So which means that there is certain level of capacity available with the government departments that
Right.
are looking into that sector. But yes, because of the complex nature, you may require a lot of specialized skills. And those specialized skills, in my opinion, can always be outsourced.
Right.
The government is not in the business of developing power projects all the time. You would need to build enough power projects to meet the demand of the nation, but you would not be keeping on building every year. I want to build, few thousand megawatts on an annual basis. That you'll reach a saturation point after which you don't need. So for those areas where the detailed planning needs to be, investigation need to be done, where the legal vetting has to be done, where contractual documents have to be prepared, taking into account international laws and so on, that it may be cheaper for the government to outsource that to consultancy firms. And here again, Joe, I thought one interesting thing that we had in the project that we did in Laos. In Laos, after having developed hydropower projects and that for so long, they suddenly realized that, and since they were going to continue to develop many projects, they realized that it was better if they could develop some sort of template agreements. So then they came out with standard power development agreements. They came out with standard concession agreements. And I think, in my opinion, I think it makes, it's a good thing, because the developer will know that, okay, this is the model agreement that we have. And so basically our negotiation with the government will be based around these model agreements. So there may be negotiations on commercial issues, on the royalty that you may have to pay the government, on taxation issues. But otherwise, most issues may remain more or less standard. And so a standard agreement is in some ways quite useful. And for the developer, I think they would probably find it much easier if they knew that there was a standard agreement that's been available. So just to answer your question in terms of the need to develop large capacities, and where the need to use those capacities are limited, is better to outsource it. But where you need to use that capacity on a regular basis, then you need to invest in the manpower in developing that area. And one area where I feel in the past is the monitoring and inspection.
Yes, actually.
Monitoring and inspection is a government role, because the private sector, at the end of the day, he wants to maximize his profits. So he may have a project estimate based on certain, conditions or certain requirements. And later, once the work starts, he may compromise on that. He might change, the materials may need to be of an inferior standard and so on. And that is where the monitoring and inspection needs to improve. And this is where governments can play a major role, because to outsource monitoring and inspection functions may be a little bit of a challenge. And this is where, governments should focus on. And in many countries, you have the regulatory body in the energy sector is an independent body, So they work like an autonomous agency. So they do not need to depend on government manpower. So they can invest in the required manpower skills without having to depend on government budget. So that sort of a thing is very, very possible if you follow that mechanism. But if you follow the standard procedure, because in governments, we tend to believe that you should be working in this department today, and tomorrow you can go anywhere. So we are in the government, the focus is too much on generalists rather than on specialists, And monitoring and inspection being a specialized function, it may be a good idea to make them a little bit autonomous, particularly from an HR and finance perspective.
Right. So that means if we need to do so by emphasizing the monitoring and inspection of the power sector, so the capacity of the regulators or the government organization have to be focusing on making sure that their staff, their personnel will be able to monitor the power plants which is operated by the private sector. And from what I see also at the same time, the private sector also have to responsible by giving reportings, and also there is some internal monitoring and inspection on their side so that they can submit the report to the government. So it's a kind of dual roles of both sides that they have to work together. Is that correct?
That's correct. Now, in terms of the reporting mechanism, I think a lot of it would be probably clearly mentioned in your concession agreement on what type of reporting you may need to do on a monthly basis, quarterly basis, and so on. But as far as the monitoring and inspection are concerned, these are, in my opinion, people with little specialized skills. They need to go during the construction phase. They need to go and see that the construction quality is being maintained. During the operation and maintenance phase, they need to go and see that those, they're being operated in a proper manner. Because at the end of the day, you have to remember that after the concession period is over, the asset gets sent back to the government. So you cannot have an asset where the life is totally finished. The asset should be able to continue to generate electricity with some little investments here and there.
So maybe our last question is about what is the preparation when that projects transfer to the government after completing the concession year. So how the preparation should be done for the transfer of that assets and also the power plants?
Yeah, that again, Joe, I would mention here that the concession agreement would have certain provisions on handback terms. So most likely 5 years prior to the end of the concession period, the government might start, monitoring the maintenance aspects. They may look at the maintenance of many life components, because many components may have to be changed based on certain time or usage. So whether those things have to be done. And then when the asset is handed back to the government, it must be in working condition. And so you would also say things like wear and tear, things like efficiency. At the end of the day, if you are expecting the power plant to generate so much, you may be willing to accept certain wear and tear and certain degrading of power, but it cannot go down beyond certain agreed levels. So those aspects will all be included in the concession agreement, and particularly in the last few years of takeover, they will have to be monitored very strictly.
All right.
There may also be provisions that after the concession period is over, government may want to outsource that from a management perspective. Now, that becomes a different PPP model altogether. So here you are not building any assets, but you're only taking managing it's a management contract, or in some cases you can call it like an aftermarket. And so you're operating like an operating lease. So this is different from the initial aspect of the concession period. Yeah.
Right.
And of course, now, since we are reaching almost the last part of our time, Joe, I would also like to mention something on the environmental and social issues.
Please.
I think this is very, very important, because we cannot afford to build projects or assets that has serious implications on the environment, serious implications on people. Maybe hundreds or thousands of people may be displaced with not being provided proper compensation and so on. So those aspects need to be taken into account. And these are things where during the initial consultation period is very, very important. You have to consult with people who live in the project locality. When you talk about environmental issues, the energy regulator and the environmental regulator should not be seen as at loggerheads. They must work together. They must have clear understanding on what type of environment do we want to maintain in our country. So prior consultation in these areas is very, very important. And to the extent possible, we should also try to give local ownership to the people. That, in my opinion, suddenly sees the local people sees something that is coming up in their area where they might suddenly have some long-term gain, not just electricity. I mean, the electricity the nation gains, but for the local people, is there some additional benefits besides the compensation that they're being provided? And they have some sense of ownership. So these are also I think, important aspects that need to be taken into account while trying to structure proper PPP.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sonam Chering. Your talk, your presentation is really, first of all, bring to me back all the information that we have exchanged when we are doing the projects together. And I believe that the materials and the content that Mr. Sonam has been explaining will not only benefit to the people in AIT who are studying in the power sector, energy sectors, academically, but also for those professionals, and also the government sector who are working in the power sectors and energy production, renewable energy. We will also get the benefit, get very useful talks, because there is a lot of various perspectives that you can think about, and these cover all the aspects of the PPP that is down to the operational level, is down to the policy and regulation that would facilitate the power sector to be more sustainable, to be more 3E integrated, and also to be more, screening first before making decisions to investment. So this is something that really enlightened us, and also I believe the audience, that can carry on and think over about this and becoming the next, topics for further discussion, and also the further research projects that can be carried on, and also for the policy and regulation that the government might be thinking about. So thank you very much,
Joe,
Mr. Sonam. Yes, please.
Yeah, Joe, if I may, before you conclude, it's been a pleasure in joining this webinar organized by AIT. We work together, and so it was very easy to communicate, and I've enjoyed the discussions. The questions that you raised were very critical and very useful. And if there are any questions that are being raised by some of the people who may be hearing us or listening, watching us, you can always forward that to me, and I can respond to you in the best manner possible. So it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much, Joe. And
thank you so much. Thank you very much. It's our pleasure, and thank you so much. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
So thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to the audience who are listening to our webinar, and we are meeting again after 15 days, and we are make sure that we are bringing the issues and topics that will be very useful to you all, for the general audience, for the researcher, policymakers, and scientists, and also the AIT community. Thank you again. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.